with all of us our spiritual past. So please, let's welcome our own Reverend Kathy Cynthia.
So you didn't all take the weekend off, huh? Good for you. 2 for the price of 1. I don't know if that's good or not. So Mark and I are going to be talking about spiritual paths in our own ways. And following a spiritual path is like searching for something that you think is going to make you complete. And if you're looking outside yourself for that and you're not finding what you want, I'm going to help you come to the realization that you need to start looking on the inside. How do you find your own spiritual path? Well, shock of shocks, you're already on it. And so it's time to wonder if you jumped on a bus, didn't bother looking at the destination on the front, and you have no idea where you're going. Or if you decided on a journey you wanted to take, you're the driver, and you have a destination in mind. And you know that on a road trip, you can change your destination. I've always said that I'm a traveler, not a tourist. And so I was thrilled the other day to read a comment by G.K. Chesterton that said, the traveler sees what he sees when he travels. The tourist sees what he's come to see. You may have to think about that for a minute. But when we're the driver in our lives, we can look forward to wonderful happenings, knowing that we decide what to see, and not be looking at a checklist that has been directed by somebody else, as wonderful as that advice can be, and we check off, I did this, and I did this, and I did this, and they told me I've got to see this. And so sometimes we miss out on wonderful opportunities, just people things and great happenings. You have the power over your mind, your journey, your spiritual path. It's not an outside event that guides this. So when you realize this, you're going to find joy and satisfaction and the strength and the ability to handle the bumps in the road because you're prepared for it. My summer travels this year involved a road. I can't swim that far. It was a riverboat cruise up the Danube. I'm just thinking of all the steps I got. Not on the boat, but off the boat. And I was surprised to find that I was really overwhelmed when I looked at the beauty and the extravagance of the churches and cathedrals there, having lived in Europe for some years, that I felt a closing in and realized that the beauty of European churches, and that includes Britain until the end of October, Brexit, we don't talk about it. But the teaching that went along with the religion of the day probably stopped people thinking outside the box, froze their feelings about being free to express thoughts and staying with the religion of that day. They may have felt it was impossible or even dangerous to express how they felt about things, and definitely about a personal relationship with God. Now, Martin Luther in the 1400s was the catalyst of the 16th century Reformation, and his stand led, in the end, to the emergency of the first sect to break away from the Roman Church. And his followers became known as Protestants. That's what I used to call them as a kid, and then someone pointed out as Protestant. I felt really silly, but never mind. Initially, they were Protestants. Henry VIII started the process of creating the Church of England after he split with the Pope in the 1500s. Now, his motives were a little less than spiritual. He was a naughty chap, but anyway. And John Wesley in the 1700s, an Anglican church clergyman, with his brother, began the Methodist movement. I think it took tremendous courage back then to break away from the formalized style of religion. And I've experienced many forms of traditional religions, Methodism, Presbyterianism, Scottish Baptist, Church of England, And I settled for Unity, which was part of my family life, because it made so much more sense to me. And it was an easy transition to Science of Mind when I started listening to Dr. Frank Richelieu on my commute to the Valley, where I was working at the time. I subsequently became a member here. But his words made sense, so did the teaching, and I wasn't being told that a particular teaching was the only way to think and the only way to God, because that made absolutely no sense to me. Ernest Holmes, the founder of our teaching, believed, and I quote, that people share universality of all life, and that this unification gives all people the divine participation. You yourself are an individualization of this thing. He said, there is a depth and meaning to your own being, and if you can discover it, it will answer all your questions. Born in 1887 on a small Maine farm, Dr. Holmes spent his teenage years outdoors, and he asked himself a lot of questions, just as we all do. What is God? Who am I? Why am I here? But he didn't stop there. His questioning led to him writing that book in 1926 called The Science of Mind, which we call our textbook. And it outlined the foundational viewpoints of modern new thought. He didn't plan on building a church. He just loved discussing what he was learning and sharing his passion for the writings of philosophies that opened his mind to a greater understanding of his spiritual path. He wrote, every man becomes his own philosophy, his own institution, and what he has is conditioned by what he is. You're married to your soul for better or worse, for richer or poorer, for life and death, now and forever. And sometimes that thought frightened me. I didn't always like myself, but I couldn't get a divorce. Oh, Ernest, I had no idea I had something in common with you. But as some of you will know, I've often wanted to divorce myself. This individual interpretation was a theme by which Ernest Holmes lived. And even though he chose his spiritual path, and he never veered from it, he was very tolerant of other people's ideas. He never criticized another person's thoughts. When we're quietly confident in our beliefs, there's no need to go after other people's, no matter how misled we feel they are. Reading Emerson was like drinking water to me, Ernest once said. I've studied him all my life. Reading Emerson for the first time gave me a realization that in a certain sense, every man has to interpret the universe in terms of his own thinking and personal relationships. And that in order to do that, he has to have faith and confidence in his own interpretation. At the end of July, our guest singer, Tina Meeks, sang the song, I Surrender All. That song's been part of my life hymn book, and her beautiful rendition stayed with me for days. And in thinking about it, it took me to a very deep awareness that surrender is not weakness. It's an act of faith, and it's an act of trust. And when we get in the daily practice surrendering our old thoughts and unnecessary stuff in our heads, which I heard Reverend Mary refer to, we can get in touch with what we really believe. We can welcome new ideas, and we can be courageous to own it as well as live it. Now, around the year 179 AD, I know that's old-fashioned, but anyway, Marcus Aurelius, who believed in Roman gods, also wrote about a higher power, higher than his gods. He referred to this as reason, the cosmos, and providence. Now, I'm a fan of good old Marcus, and I was delighted to see mention of him in Regensburg when I was there recently. So bear with me when I read a translation that I found of his work, because it's relevant to my sharing. You have to concentrate. Remember how long thou hast been putting off these things, and how often thou hast received an opportunity from the gods, yet dost not use it. Thou must now at least perceive of what universe thou art a part, and of what administrator of the universe thy existence is an efflux. You still with me? And that a limit of times is fixed for thee, which if thou dost not use for clearing away the clouds from thy mind, it will go, and thou wilt go, and it will never return. Since it is possible that thou mayest depart from life this very moment, regulate every act and thought accordingly. Now, since he wrote in Greek, I don't think that was his translation. But the essence of it is still really powerful and part of our teaching. He knew back then, 179 AD, that we're all part of the universe and that we don't live forever, and that if we haven't taken advantage of the opportunities offered us by the universe, we better get started, because we don't know how long we have. Why didn't I say that in the first place? Because it was fun to read, and I am allowed. So, time is extremely limited and goes by fast, so do what makes you happy and cut negativity out of your life. These days we have the freedom to explore without fear of retribution, so take time to work out how you want to run your life. We have freedom to be true to ourselves and our moral compass, freedom to allow others to be themselves and see them without judgment. And we're blessed with the gift of free will. We can remind ourselves that no situation, incident, or a personal encounter has power in itself. We have a choice between peace and suffering. So today, choose peace, choose love, choose abundance, choose wholeness. You're free to choose, and don't just chase happiness. Enjoy your life as it comes. I was reminded that yesterday was the anniversary of Princess Diana's passing, and one of her life philosophies was, carry out a random act of kindness with no expectation of reward, safe in the knowledge that one day someone may do the same for you. Sometimes the longest journey that we make is 16 inches from our head to our heart. So follow your heart. And in the meantime, be strong, be kind to yourself, and know that you are enough. You are worthy. So, with that, I'm delighted to hand over to Marcus Ruth. He even spells his name the right way, M-A-R-C. So, and I welcome him up here. Thank you, Mark.
Oh, Reverend Kathy, to me, is always so insightful, joyful, and delightful, not to mention inspirational. Didn't you do a wonderful job? I welcome you all today to the Redondo Beach Center for Spiritual Living, because I know that you are here on purpose. And your purpose is you're probably thinking about a spiritual path. You're searching for a spiritual path. You're thinking about getting back on your spiritual path. Or maybe you're even looking how to better navigate that spiritual path that you are on. Now, the Centers for Spiritual Living, they have a vision of a world that works for all. They have a very specific purpose of awakening humanity to its spiritual magnificence. And its mission is to provide tools that allow for personal and global transformation. And last weekend, Thursday to Sunday, my wife Monica and I had the opportunity to use one of those spiritual tools. And in my opinion, going to a retreat is a spiritual tool. And we had the opportunity to go to Asilomar. How many people here have been to Asilomar? Okay, quite a few, but there's a number who haven't been. Asilomar is a state park resort, has conference rooms, restaurants, can probably house 1,000 people. It's up by Carmel and Monterey, and it's right next to the ocean. It even has a little boardwalk where you can walk out onto the sand dunes and actually down to the beach and in amongst tall trees also. It is just a wonderful conference site. And we went to a Centers of Spiritual Living retreat. And we had been here for 20 years at this center, heard people go to Asilomar, and we had never done it. So we said, this is an opportunity that we don't want to miss. It turns out that the theme for the retreat was on sacred ground, because Ernest Holmes, the founder of Science of Mind, and religious scientist, he hosted, starting in the 1940s, an annual retreat up to Asilomar. Even after his passing, Science of Mind went there all the way until 2013, when for some reason it stopped, and now they had this one a couple weeks ago. Couldn't afford to miss it. Part of the reason I think they said it was on sacred ground is because of those Dr. Holmes and all the others who went before in those retreats. And as part of the whole format, going from Thursday night to Saturday night, we had 11 speakers, including Dr. Kenneth Gordon, the spiritual leader of overall Science of Mind, and many of the 10 other speakers, most of them were spiritual leaders of their own center. There was also 12 workshops, so there was a lot to get you on your spiritual path. But being on the sacred ground, the people who organized this retreat did something very special for those speakers. Because in 1959, Ernest Holmes gave a very important talk. They call it the Sermon by the Sea. And so what they did is they had each one of these speakers, they gave them a quote out of Dr. Holmes' talk, and they could talk about it or they didn't. And part of reawakening my spiritual magnificence, getting back onto my spiritual path, came from that retreat and some of those talks. And I'd like to share some of those with you. The first speaker had this quote, and this is from Ernest Holmes' Sermon by the Sea. "Find me one person who is for something and against nothing, who is redeemed enough not to condemn others out of the fear of their own soul, and I will find another Savior, another Jesus, and an exalted human being." That speaker then gave the traditional Science of Mind lessons of what you resist persists. If you have negativity going on in your mind, what are you going to attract? If you're in opposition to something, it usually comes from a fear-based point of view. Mother Teresa said, don't invite me to an anti-war rally. I'll go to a rally for peace, because that changes the whole consciousness. So this speaker took this quote, and Reverend Kathy mentioned it in her talk about there's no reason to condemn the other point of view. And so it's not just being for something, it's also not condemning the other point of view. So that was one of the talks. The second talk that was very memorable to me was from Reverend Mike McMorrow. And he's the spiritual director at Granada Hills, and he has spoken up at our Arrowhead retreat. And let me quote the Sermon by the Sea quote that he had. "Find me someone who is no longer sad, whose memory has been redeemed from morbidity, and I shall hear laughter." Now, don't confuse morbidity with mortality. Morbidity is simply the condition of illness or disease or just being unhealthy. Well, Reverend Mike McMorrow's talk was on the spirituality of a recovering redneck. Of course, he called it a metaphysician, Jeff Foxworthy, told a few redneck jokes. He had the audience in the palm of his hand, the laughter that he had going, and there were over 500 participants in this retreat, and that auditorium was filled. And Mike had them laughing. However, Mike then was able to go from what is he redeeming? He's a recovering redneck. And he went into his past angers and language and redneck philosophies towards women and other minority groups, and giving such a heartfelt apology and recognizing that his new consciousness, getting on his new spiritual path, took him from that redneck philosophy to one of being a spiritual director at a Center for Spiritual Living. He had him not only laughing, he had him crying, he had him moving. And I think you can see with experiences like that, it was easy for me to get back onto my spiritual path. Now, one other speaker, first time I had met him, Dr. David Bruner, and he had been a minister for 27 years. And, a lot of those ministers, they're getting up in age. But this Dr. Bruner was only 54 years old. He had been a minister since he was 27. And he gave a powerful talk about his spiritual path. But he first told a story about learning a foreign language. And I was going, oh, yeah, I took some German in high school and college, and yeah, I went to Germany, and I could say a few sentences. He said that the average student learning a foreign language spends maybe 500 or 1,000 hours learning that language. And his experience when he went to the country of the language he was studying, he said, well, the 7-year-old could speak way more fluently than he could and was correcting his grammar. And here he is, college educated. Well, he makes the very powerful point that 7-year-old had been immersed in that language for 20,000 hours because that's all they lived in. And then, how did he convert that to science of mind? And he says, well, how often are you speaking your language of science of mind principles? Now, being a former Catholic, I know that I went to church on Sunday because if you didn't, it was a mortal sin, and you know what that means, right? So I dutifully went and occasionally went to confession, because you got to do that so often, otherwise. And being a practicing, I can't say good Catholic, but practicing, my sister and I, we would go, and this is in my teen years, so, okay, if you show up 10 minutes late to service, or you go, nah, 15 minutes late, nah, we got there in time for the talk, come on. Well, then how soon can you leave after the talk? Well, you want to beat the crowd and okay. Now, I got to say honestly that I probably didn't recall after that how often I practiced my Catholicism. But I can say this, getting onto my spiritual path and awakening to my spiritual magnificence, this is a practice I can use on a daily basis, because as I awaken to my spiritual magnificence and I see the God essence in me, and I can see the God essence in me and in everyone around me and in nature and the power of the one, how powerful is it to have an interaction with people coming from a point of view of peace, love, and joy, recognizing that they're the God essence and you're the God essence? How would that affect each and every situation and encounter when you're out there if you're coming from that point of view? And those talks up at Arrowhead got me once again back on that spiritual path, to recognize that, yes, I'm awakening to my spiritual magnificence. Now, I'm not all of humanity, but if I awaken to it, and if you awaken to it, and we're all part of the one mind, it's like throwing that rock into the pond and having those vibrations. But you know, to understand the theory, to have the knowledge, that's a very good thing. But knowledge is not wisdom. It's the ability to use that knowledge constructively that gives you the wisdom. I know that I helped get back on my path. Arrowhead Retreat, you go up to the mountain, raise your consciousness, and you come back different. I felt like I came back different from Asilomar. So the choice is yours. You're on your spiritual path, and as my wife Monica always says when I have a choice, I know you'll choose wisely. And so it is.